Most people think they know the story of the Spanish Inquisition, hooded fanatics dragging innocents into torture chambers, hundreds of thousands, maybe millions, burned alive for the crime of thinking the wrong thought. A church so drunk on power that it turned an entire country into a 400-year bonfire. It's become a punchline, a byword for a religious fanaticism so absolute that we still use the phrase "nobody expects the Spanish Inquisition" as a joke about overwhelming, irrational force. And that's exactly the problem, because somewhere between the history and the joke, the actual Spanish Inquisition disappeared, replaced by a legend so vivid that most people have never once questioned it. And here's the thing about that legend: it isn't nothing. The Spanish Inquisition was a real institution that did real, documented harm across 3.5 centuries. People were imprisoned unjustly. People were tortured. People were burned alive in public squares while crowds watched. An entire religious minority was expelled from its homeland. A climate of suspicion and denunciation settled over Spanish society for generations. None of what I'm about to tell you erases any of that. And if at any point this starts to sound like an argument that the Inquisition wasn't so bad, that's not what this is. What it actually is something more unsettling. Because when historians finally got access to the Inquisition's own archives, the actual paperwork the institution generated about itself, case by case, trial by trial, for 350 years, the numbers that came back didn't match the legend at all. They were a fraction of it. And the story of how that legend got built, who built it, and why it has survived so much longer than the truth, turns out to be almost as revealing as the Inquisition itself. So let's start where the myth starts, and then let's follow the paper trail. Picture Seville in 1483. A converted merchant, a man who years earlier had been baptized a Christian, sits in a stone chamber. His hands are folded, his heart is hammering. In the privacy of his own home on Friday evenings, he has been lighting candles and murmuring prayers his grandparents taught him. Prayers in a faith he was supposed to have abandoned. Someone in his household, perhaps a servant, perhaps a rival, perhaps a relative under pressure, has denounced him. And now he waits to learn what the tribunal of the Holy Office intends to do with him. That scene, repeated with variations across Spain for centuries, is the emotional core of what most people imagine when they hear the words Spanish Inquisition. And it is, in its essentials, accurate. That kind of fear was real, and it happened to real people. But to understand why it happened and how large it actually became, you have to go back 5 years earlier to the actual founding of the institution, because the founding tells you almost everything about what this really was. On the 1st of November, 1478, Pope Sixtus IV issued a papal bull authorizing King Ferdinand of Aragon and Queen Isabella of Castile to establish a new tribunal of the faith in their kingdoms. And right there, in that single sentence, is the detail that changes the entire shape of the story. This was not primarily a project of the Catholic Church acting on its own initiative. Earlier medieval inquisitions across Europe had operated under direct papal control, run by the Church for the Church. The Spanish Inquisition was different from the start. It answered to the crown. The monarchs appointed the inquisitors. The monarchs controlled the Supreme Council that ran the whole machine. When the Pope himself later tried to intervene in specific cases and rein in what he considered excessive severity, Ferdinand essentially told him to mind his own business, that this was a matter of royal prerogative. And the Pope backed down. Think about what that tells you. This was, from its very first breath, less a religious crusade than a tool of the state. And the timing tells you why the state wanted it. 1478 sits right in the middle of a pivotal moment in Spanish history. Ferdinand and Isabella had married to unite the two most powerful kingdoms on the Iberian Peninsula, Aragon and Castile, and they were in the process of building something that had never quite existed before, a single, centralized Spanish state, forged out of a patchwork of independent, often quarreling territories that had spent centuries fighting each other as much as they fought anyone else. 14 years later, in 1492, they would complete the reconquest of the peninsula from its last Muslim kingdom, and in that same extraordinary year, launch Columbus's voyage west and issue the decree expelling Spain's Jewish population. 1478 to 1492 is the birth canal of modern Spain, and the Inquisition was one of the primary instruments used to force that birth. A newly stitched together kingdom, still nervous about where its true loyalties lay, decided it needed one national religion, one enforced orthodoxy, one population that could be trusted not to have secret allegiances to a different faith or a different power. Religious uniformity wasn't just a matter of piety. It was, quite explicitly, a strategy of nation building. Historians studying this period describe it plainly. This was the crown centralizing political control by centralizing religious control at exactly the moment it needed its new, fragile union to hold together. So who did the new tribunal actually go after? Overwhelmingly, at first, a specific group, the conversos. These were Jews who had converted or whose families had converted to Christianity, often under intense social and legal pressure, sometimes generations earlier. And a strain of suspicion had built up around them. The belief, sincere in some cases and cynically convenient in others, that many of these converts were secretly still practicing Judaism behind closed doors, what the authorities called Judaizing. In 1477, Queen Isabella visited Seville and, according to the accounts, was persuaded by a fiery Dominican friar that this kind of hidden apostasy was widespread among the city's converso population. Investigators were sent. Reports came back confirming the suspicions, and the machinery of the Inquisition was set in motion to root it out. The very first public tribunal, held in Seville in 1481, burned 6 people. And what followed in that first decade was, by any measure, the most violent period in the entire history of the institution. The man who would come to personify the Inquisition more than anyone else, Tomás de Torquemada, was appointed Inquisitor General in 1483. Over his 15-year tenure, something on the order of 2,000 people were burned at the stake. That is a genuinely staggering, brutal number concentrated in an extraordinarily short span of years. And it is the period that gave the entire institution its terrifying reputation for the following 5 centuries. If the Inquisition had simply ceased to exist after Torquemada died in 1498, the popular image of mass, industrial religious slaughter would be, roughly speaking, defensible. But it didn't cease to exist. It continued for another 336 years. And this is where the story historians tell, and the story most people were taught, begin to diverge sharply. Because what happened to the execution rate after that first brutal decade is one of the most undertold facts in this entire history. For most of the 20th century, nobody could actually answer the question of how many people the Inquisition killed, because nobody had systematically gone through its own records. The number that circulated for generations, the one that fed the popular imagination, traces back to a Spanish priest named Juan Antonio Llorente, who had himself served as a secretary to the Inquisition and had access to its archives in the early 1800s, right after Napoleon's forces had temporarily abolished the institution. Llorente, writing with considerable personal animus against the tribunal he had once served, published a set of statistics claiming nearly 32,000 executions across the Inquisition's history. For most of the 19th and 20th centuries, that number, or numbers close to it, became the accepted figure, repeated in book after book. And it's the ancestor of the far larger, even more inflated popular claims of hundreds of thousands or millions of victims that circulate today. Numbers that, frankly, no serious historian has ever actually produced from the evidence. Then, starting in the 1970s, something changed. A pair of historians, Gustav Henningsen and Jaime Contreras, gained access to an enormous cache of documents held in Spain's National Historical Archive, specifically a series of annual reports called the Relaciones de Causas, essentially case summaries that the regional tribunals were required to send back to the Central Supreme Council in Madrid every single year for well over a century. This wasn't propaganda, and it wasn't a hostile ex-official settling scores. This was the Inquisition's own internal bureaucratic paperwork, the dry, unglamorous record-keeping of a state institution reporting up its own chain of command. And when Henningsen and Contreras built a statistical database out of it, covering the years 1540 to 1700, the heart of the Inquisition's operational life, they found roughly 44,700 formal trials. And out of those 44,700 cases, the number actually sentenced to execution was 826, plus another 778 executed only in effigy, meaning the person had already died or fled, and a statue or portrait was burned in their place instead of an actual living human being. Read that again. Out of nearly 45,000 real trials across 160 years, fewer than 900 people were actually put to death. That's less than 2%. Since that original study, other historians working through different archives in different regions, scholars like Jean-Pierre Dedieu, Joseph Perez, and William Monter, have refined and debated the exact figures, and their estimates do vary. Some push the total number of trials across the entire 356-year span as high as 200,000. Some push total executions, including that brutal opening decade under Torquemada, as high as 10,000. But virtually every serious modern historian working from the actual archival evidence lands somewhere in the same general neighborhood, a total execution count across the entire history of the Spanish Inquisition, from 1478 to 1834, of somewhere between 3,000 and 10,000 people. Most of that is concentrated in the earliest years. After the first 50 years or so, the execution rate drops off a cliff and stays low for the remaining 3 centuries of the institution's existence. Compare that to the numbers that live in popular culture, and the gap is not small. It is not a rounding error. It is the difference between a genuine historical atrocity, which this still absolutely is, and something several orders of magnitude larger that simply never happened. One comparison that historians researching this period often point to, almost as a gut check, is what was happening at exactly the same time in supposedly more tolerant parts of Europe. In the Netherlands, in the city of Antwerp alone, secular courts executed 103 people for heresy in just 5 years, between 1557 and 1562. That is more people killed for religious offenses in one Dutch city in 5 years than are documented as dying across the entire Spanish Inquisition during that same stretch. The country that has become the global shorthand for religious persecution was not, in raw numbers, uniquely bloodthirsty compared to its neighbors. It was, if anything, less lethal than several of them. Now, I want to pause here and be very careful, because there is a version of this argument that tips over into something dishonest, and I don't want to go there. The fact that the Inquisition executed thousands rather than hundreds of thousands does not mean it was a benign or gentle institution. It does not mean the fear it generated was manageable or fair. And one of the sharpest criticisms leveled at the historians who first published these lower numbers back in the 1990s is exactly this point, that a low body count doesn't tell you much about the psychological weight the institution placed on an entire society for 3.5 centuries. You didn't need to be arrested to live your whole life differently because of the Inquisition. You needed to know it existed. A neighbor who might report you. A servant who might overhear something. A grandparent's ancestry that could be quietly investigated at any time. Historians describe this as a genuinely paranoid society, one where the institutional reach in terms of actual trials might have been limited, but the psychological reach, the low hum of anxiety and self-censorship that shaped ordinary conversation and behavior for generations, was not limited at all. Both of these things, the smaller than mythologized death toll and the very real climate of fear, are true at the same time, and a full understanding of the Inquisition has to hold on to both. So, if the popular image of the execution numbers is wrong, what about the popular image of how these trials actually worked? The torture chambers, the arbitrary judges, the guilty until proven guilty presumption. Here again, the archival record complicates the picture in ways that are genuinely surprising. The Inquisition operated according to a formal, written legal code, and inquisitors who violated its procedures could actually be removed from office for doing so. The accused, at least on paper, was presumed innocent until the case against them was proven. If a defendant believed a particular judge was biased against them, they had the right to formally request a different one. They were permitted to consult a legal representative and to appeal their sentence, first to the Supreme Council in Madrid, and in some cases, all the way up to the Pope himself. Anyone who was found to have made a false accusation faced serious punishment of their own, which created at least some disincentive against reckless denunciation. And crucially, the overwhelming majority of people who were tried and found guilty were not executed at all. Most received what the Inquisition called reconciliation, essentially formal penance, sometimes public humiliation, sometimes fines or confiscation of property, sometimes a period of imprisonment, but a sentence that ended with the person still alive and, in the eyes of the church, restored to the faith. Torture is the piece of this story that people find hardest to reconcile with any of that, and understandably so, because torture absolutely did happen, and pretending otherwise would be its own kind of dishonesty. But even here, the documentary record shows something more regulated and more limited than the free-for-all of popular imagination. Researchers who have gone through the case files, including a detailed empirical study of the Toledo Tribunal's own torture sessions, find that physical torture was used in under 2% of proceedings, a rate that was, by most comparative estimates, considerably lower than the 10 to 20% or higher rates documented in secular courts elsewhere in Europe during the same period. When torture was authorized, a physician and a notary were typically required to be present. Sessions were expected to stop the moment a confession was obtained, and confessions extracted under torture were not automatically accepted as valid. They had to be voluntarily repeated and ratified afterward, away from the torture chamber, or they didn't count. In the specific Toledo case files researchers examined, several sessions ended before any actual torture took place at all, because the accused confessed the moment they were shown the instruments or strapped into position. None of this makes the practice acceptable by any modern standard. It was still coercive, still often brutal, and still capable of extracting false confessions from terrified, innocent people. But it was a bureaucratized, comparatively restrained version of a practice that was, at the time, more or less universal across European justice systems, not some uniquely Spanish invention of sadism. And there's one more place where the record runs almost completely opposite to the popular image, and it might be the single most surprising fact in this entire story. Ask most people to picture the height of European witch-burning hysteria, and if they picture anything specific at all, they'll often picture inquisitors and religious tribunals. In reality, the worst witch panics in European history happened primarily in the German-speaking lands and other parts of Northern and Central Europe, driven mostly by secular and local courts, and they killed tens of thousands of people, overwhelmingly women, over the course of the 16th and 17th centuries. Spain, by contrast, had one of the lowest witch execution rates on the entire continent, and the reason is almost too ironic to believe. It was the Spanish Inquisition itself that suppressed it. In 1609, in the Basque region along the border with France, a wave of witchcraft accusations exploded into one of the largest witch panics in European history. Something like 7,000 people were eventually named as suspects, over 1,000 of them children between the ages of 7 and 14. Local secular authorities were ready to prosecute aggressively, and the Inquisition's central leadership in Madrid, alarmed by the scale of what was unfolding, sent an investigator named Alonso de Salazar Frias to look into it. Salazar spent months traveling through the region, taking depositions, examining evidence, and what he found convinced him that almost none of it was real. He wrote back to his superiors with a line that has survived as one of the most quietly devastating sentences in the whole archive. "There were neither witches nor bewitched," he concluded, until people started writing and talking about them. His skepticism, and the skepticism of other senior churchmen who agreed with him, effectively shut the panic down. New evidentiary rules were issued, making it almost impossible to secure a witchcraft conviction on the Spanish mainland ever again. In the region of Castile specifically, historians find records of essentially no witches ever burned by the Inquisition, across the institution's entire history. The very body that modern popular culture uses as the ultimate symbol of superstitious, murderous religious fanaticism was, in the specific case of witch hunting, one of the most effective breaks on exactly that kind of hysteria anywhere in Europe. Meanwhile, secular courts operating without the Inquisition's oversight in places like Catalonia went on to execute roughly 100 people for witchcraft before the tribunal finally intervened and reasserted control over those cases too. So if the death toll was smaller than the legend and the witch hunting record runs almost backward from what you'd expect, where did the legend, the millions dead, torture chamber on every corner version of the story actually come from? And this is where the story turns from historical revision into something closer to a case study in how propaganda gets made and how it outlives the truth it was built to obscure. The term historians actually use for this phenomenon is the black legend, La Leyenda Negra, and its origins are not mysterious at all. They trace directly to specific political conflicts with clear self-interested actors on the other side. In the second half of the 16th century, Spain, under King Philip II, was the dominant power in Europe, ruling over the Netherlands, among many other territories. And the Netherlands rebelled. The Dutch revolt was a long, brutal war for independence, and like every war of that kind, it came with a propaganda campaign attached. In 1581, the rebel leader William of Orange published a document known as his Apology, a sweeping public indictment of Philip II that accused the Spanish crown of monstrous cruelty and that leaned heavily on the terrifying reputation of the Inquisition as proof of Spain's supposedly uniquely fanatical character. It was effective, deliberate political messaging crafted by a movement that had every strategic reason to paint its enemy in the darkest possible colors, and it worked exactly as intended. England picked up the same thread for its own reasons. After the failure of the Spanish Armada in 1588, a triumphant English national mythology grew up around the idea of a small, righteous Protestant island heroically resisting a monstrous, tyrannical Catholic superpower, and the Inquisition slotted perfectly into that story as the embodiment of everything English readers were being told to fear about Spanish Catholicism. Pamphlets, sermons, and popular histories across Protestant Europe recycled and amplified the same images for the next 2 centuries, each retelling adding a little more color, a little more horror, a little more scale. Separately, but often blended together in the popular imagination until the two became almost indistinguishable, the genuinely documented atrocities committed by Spanish conquistadors in the Americas, atrocities that a Spanish Dominican friar named Bartolomé de las Casas had himself written about in searing detail specifically to try to stop them, were seized on by the very same rival powers and folded into the broader narrative of a uniquely, almost supernaturally cruel Spanish national character. It's worth sitting with that irony for a second. Some of the most damning source material for the Black Legend was written by a Spanish Catholic churchman trying to protect indigenous people from his own countrymen, and it was later repurposed by Spain's Protestant rivals into a weapon against Spain itself. By the time a Spanish historian named Julián Huderias formally coined the phrase the Black Legend in a 1914 book examining the phenomenon, the pattern had been running, largely unchallenged, for over 300 years. Centuries of accumulated wartime propaganda had simply calcified into accepted historical fact, repeated in school books and popular histories long after anyone remembered it had started as a Dutch and English information war against a specific 16th century king. None of this means Spain gets a clean pass, and it's worth saying that plainly, because it would be its own kind of distortion to swing the pendulum all the way to the opposite extreme, and some writers pushing back against the Black Legend have done exactly that, minimizing real and documented cruelty in the name of correcting an exaggeration. The Inquisition really did use torture, even if less often than its neighbors. It really did burn people alive in public, even if far fewer than the legend claims. It really did expel Spain's entire Jewish population in 1492 under the Alhambra Decree, tearing apart communities that had lived on the Iberian Peninsula for well over 1,000 years. An act of state-sponsored ethnic and religious cleansing whose consequences echoed for centuries and which the Spanish government did not formally revoke until 1968. It really did impose, through the doctrine known as limpieza de sangre, or purity of blood, a system of hereditary discrimination that barred people descended from Jewish or Muslim ancestors from public office, universities, military honors, and church positions for generations, regardless of how devout a Catholic any individual actually was. And decades after the campaign against Jewish conversos peaked, the Inquisition turned with similar intensity toward the Moriscos, Muslims who had likewise been forced to convert, culminating eventually in their mass expulsion from Spain in the early 1600s. The Black Legend took something real and monstrously inflated its scale. It did not invent the underlying cruelty out of nothing. There's one more piece of the myth worth clearing up because it's repeated almost as often as the death toll, and that's the idea that the Inquisition is the primary reason Spain fell behind the rest of Europe, economically, and scientifically in the centuries that followed, that it single-handedly strangled Spanish intellectual life and locked the country out of the Enlightenment. It's true that the institution's later-era book censorship and the broader climate of caution it enforced around unorthodox ideas was a genuine drag on open inquiry, and Spanish intellectuals of the period certainly felt that weight. But historians examining Spain's long economic decline relative to England, France, and the Netherlands have found a far more tangled set of causes. Monetary mismanagement from the flood of American silver, chronic overextension in expensive European wars, a tax structure that discouraged commercial investment, an aristocracy that treated trade as beneath its dignity. Pinning 3 centuries of complex economic history on one religious tribunal is a satisfying story, but the evidence for it as the primary cause is thin. It's the kind of explanation that feels true because it's simple, not because the archives actually support it. So let's follow this all the way to the end, because the way the Inquisition actually died is almost as instructive as the way it was born. It was suspended once by Napoleon's occupying forces in the early 1800s, restored by a returning Spanish king, suspended again, restored again, a slow, undignified institutional death spread across a quarter century of political whiplash. And its very last act, its final execution, is one of the strangest and saddest footnotes in the entire story. In July of 1826, a poor school teacher named Cayetano Ripoll was executed in Valencia. His crime, as best historians can reconstruct it, was teaching his students to say, "Praise be to reason," instead of "praise be to God," and quietly professing deist beliefs he'd picked up as a prisoner of war years earlier. He was garroted, and by some accounts his body was afterward burned. His reported final words were, "I die reconciled to God and to man." A school teacher killed for a private philosophical opinion about the nature of God, 3.5 centuries after the tribunal had been founded to hunt down secret Jewish worship in Seville, and the whole affair provoked open outrage across Europe as an embarrassing anachronism. 8 years later, in July of 1834, the Spanish Inquisition was formally and permanently abolished by royal decree. So what is the true origin of the Spanish Inquisition, and what do popular tellings of it actually get wrong? I think the honest answer is layered, and it doesn't reduce to a single clean sentence. They get the founding wrong by treating it as a story of pure religious fervor when the archival record points just as strongly, if not more strongly, toward a calculated instrument of state building, a new and fragile monarchy using enforced religious uniformity to weld together a country that had only just been stitched into one. They get the scale wrong, inflating a genuine atrocity of several thousand deaths into an imagined slaughter of hundreds of thousands or millions. A number that traces back not to careful research, but to a 19th century score-settling account that got repeated so many times it calcified into accepted fact. Never checked against the institution's own surviving paperwork until the archives were finally opened a century and a half later. They get the mechanics wrong, imagining an arbitrary machine of pure cruelty when the internal record shows something closer to a strange, uncomfortable hybrid, a genuinely more procedural, more restrained legal system than many of its European neighbors in several specific respects, while still being an instrument of religious coercion that ruined lives, expelled entire communities, and kept a nation looking over its own shoulder for 13 generations. And they get the source of the story itself wrong, forgetting or never learning that the very image of Spain as uniquely, almost cartoonishly monstrous was substantially built, brick by brick, by rival powers who had their own wars to win and their own reasons for wanting the world to see Spain that way. None of this is an argument that the Inquisition was good or misunderstood or secretly gentle. People were tortured. People were burned alive in public while their neighbors watched. An entire Jewish community, present on that peninsula for over a millennium, was forced out in 1492 and never fully returned. Generations of Spaniards lived under a formal system of hereditary discrimination based on ancestry that reached into universities, guilds, and public office. A climate of fear and denunciation shaped ordinary life for centuries in ways no execution count alone can fully capture. All of that is real, And all of that matters, and none of it needs an inflated body count to be worth remembering and reckoning with, honestly. What the real history offers instead of the legend is something more useful, if less cinematic. It's a case study in exactly how a state builds and maintains power by fusing religious and political control together. It's a case study in how atrocity propaganda works, how a real cruelty gets picked up by a hostile power, inflated for strategic purposes, and then simply outlives the war that created it, wandering on for centuries as accepted common knowledge long after the original combatants are dust. And it's a reminder that the most useful kind of historical correction isn't the kind that tells you the bad thing you learned about didn't really happen. It's the kind that makes you look at the actual paperwork, the actual archive, the actual complicated human record, instead of the story that was simply easiest and most useful to somebody to tell. If you found this deep dive valuable, take a second to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. It genuinely helps more than you'd think, and it's what lets me keep making these long, carefully researched breakdowns of the history we thought we understood. And if you've got your own perspective on the true origins of the Spanish Inquisition, drop it in the comments. I read every single one. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.